Okay, we're live. So, hello everyone again. Today we're going to talk about CSS preprocessors, and we're going to start with the simple definition. I'm just going to move this out of the way. There we go. So, what is a preprocessor? First of all, according to MDN, the definition is simple. A CSS preprocessor is a program that lets you generate CSS from the preprocessor's own unique syntax. The image below illustrates the process quite well. You write your code in the CSS preprocessor, and when you're ready, the transpiler does its magic and optimizations, of course, and you get a CSS file you can use on your web page. So I know that sounds pretty complex, but it's actually really simple. And here's an example. The code on the left is a popular CSS preprocessor called Sass. Don't mind the syntax right now. If you don't understand it, we will dive into it later. Take note that the Sass preprocessor takes your SCSS code, it's called SCSS as you can see, and turns it into valid CSS. So briefly, the code on the left could not be run on a conventional browser, but the code on the right is good old CSS, ready to be used by any browser. So a CSS preprocessor allows the front-end developers to be more programmatic when it comes to styling, and it also allows us to take advantage of things such as functions and variables to make our CSS code more maintainable. So the code you see on the left is basically code converted into CSS on the right. And we'll get to that later. You might be wondering, I'm perfectly fine with writing regular CSS. Why do I need to complicate things with a preprocessor? Well, when your project becomes larger, more complex, and bigger than, say, 5 or 10 style sheets, there are a lot of reasons why CSS preprocessors are a very important tool for further development, and I'm going to highlight a few of the most important points. The first being the dry principle. You should already be well aware of the fundamental pillar of coding known as dry, or don't repeat yourself. In case you don't know, is that a programmer should always strive to avoid rewriting any bit of code within their application. This is often solved by taking a piece of code that may have been repeated and turning it into a reusable helper function or variable. So CSS preprocessors allow you to keep your code dry because they give you access to things like variables, mixins, and extends, which allow you to replace repeated CSS rules with something reusable. So the next point is complex logic. Preprocessors also give you access to some logical syntax so that you can create dynamic styling that responds to the output of the logic. This includes loops, if-else statements, visual nesting of CSS rules, as seen in the example earlier, of course. Overall, preprocessors allow for CSS styling that is efficient and concise in terms of how it is written, and powerful and dynamic in its ability to perform more complex logical operations. And last but not least, preprocessors give us the ability to do math operations. Of course, CSS allows it as well, but it comes out of the box for preprocessors. You can also utilize built-in functions, and not to mention make your own. And the last important point is compatibility. After spending a considerable amount of time styling a web page using only one browser to debug, as most of you do, I guess, it is very unpleasant to find out that your page does not necessarily look the same in another browser, especially old browsers like Internet Explorer 11 or older Safari. And by using a CSS preprocessor, you have all the vendor prefixes added automatically, and you are also ensured that polyfills are made available to you if you're using older browsers. So I generally told about 3 main points why you should use a preprocessor, and now I'm going to shortly tell you maybe why you shouldn't choose a preprocessor. So there are also several cases when sticking to simple CSS would be more appropriate than using a preprocessor. If your project is small and you do not plan on scaling it, you might just stick to regular CSS for the sake of simplicity. It is also easier to debug regular CSS since you won't be able to directly reference the CSS from the browser as it was generated. What I mean by that is the sources tab. So, are there any questions so far? I'll take that as a no. All right. Okay, so let's continue then. These are some of the available CSS preprocessors, with Sass, as I mentioned, being the most popular among developers. Stylus and Post CSS can also be seen in the wild, and the rest are a bit more exotic, and I don't really recommend putting much time into getting to know them better. We will be examining Sass this lecture, since to my mind it's the most popular choice nowadays, and it really doesn't differ that much from Less, basically its neighbor right here, the other popular choice. So learn one and you'll basically know how to use the other. We will explore how to set the preprocessor up, and we will explore the main functions it offers. Since this is a short lecture, I strongly recommend you go and rewrite your older projects using Sass after this lecture or on your own time to get the hang of its functionalities, since practice makes perfect. All right, so let's dig into Sass, I guess. So setting up, let's begin our journey by learning how to use Sass in the most simple and straightforward way possible. So I'm going to open up my terminal. Okay, so I'm going to make an empty folder here. All right, so the first step you need to do is basically install Sass. You can use npm g Sass. I think you're familiar with npm now. Wait, let me just zoom in a bit. You might see better. Yeah. So you should be already familiar with npm. The G flag here basically tells that install this package into your local machine, so it's available anywhere. You don't need to use the G flag if you plan on using Sass on one project only, but I'm gonna install it globally. I already have it, so it shouldn't take much time. All right. So let's go into our folder, open up VS Code. All right, let's make an index file first, of course. Boilerplate. Go. Okay, so basically this is an empty document with a hello world, of course. It will have a style.css, but I'm gonna show you how we can use Sass. So we're gonna create a style.scss. I hope you can see it, but it's not CSS, it's SCSS now. So basically what I'll do is just, wait, let me just show that it's not simple CSS because you can do this. Let's say h1 color. So this is a SCSS variable. It's called h1 color. So I create one. You can't do this in normal CSS. Well, at least not in this syntax. So let's make the color of h1 color, right? Okay, so this for now it won't work because we don't have the style CSS file, and to do that, we open up our console, we type in Sass, we specify the file first, style SCSS, and we specify what we want to convert it to. So that is style.css. Okay, it does its magic, and there we go. We have our file here. And this is normal CSS. Let's compare them here. Let me just, yeah. So this, on the left, you can see the SCSS file. And on the right, you can see the generated CSS file, which will go into our application. And to show that it actually works, I'll just open it up. There we go. Our hello world is red, as we expected it. So that is basically the simplest way to use CSS. Most of the times, the compilation phase, I mean the transpilation is handled by your framework or automatic development tools such as Gulp. But this, I just wanted to show you the simplest way to convert SCSS to CSS. Of course, we can do this, of course. Let's create a folder, for example, called CSS. And we can, yeah, we can just put our files there. Of course, change the path here. Yeah, it's styles.css. Can delete this. Yeah. And another useful command is sass. We can just specify the folder. I think it's .css, and add the watch flag. Yeah. So now, whenever we make changes, okay, let me just show you. Let's say the left screen is the SCSS and the right screen is the CSS. So let's say I make some changes here. Let's say yellow. I save it, and it automatically renders it on the right side. It's the watch command right here. I'm not sure you can see it, but I'll paste it in the chat in case you can't see it. So the watch flag is what you want to remember. All right, so any questions here? Because that's pretty much it. That's how you can use Sass. That's nothing more to it, basically. And always remember that any valid CSS is valid as CSS, but not the other way around. So if you won't have any more questions, we can continue. I'll wait a few more moments. Okay, so let's just move on to the actual examples. So the first function of preprocessors we're going to cover is nesting. Nesting is a way of grouping styles and classes in your style sheets while still keeping it dry. Do not repeat yourself. So the following code should be clear to you, as this is regular CSS. If you look closely, in 18 lines, you are repeating yourself. Notice the article class being retyped over and over again online. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. Can you see my mouse? You can. Oh, you can see my mouse. That's perfect. So basically, in every line, you're repeating article. This is the main selector, the selector for H1s, for paragraphs, for the link class, and for the link hover. Each one of them has the article repeated. So if we look at how we can improve that CSS using a preprocessor and nesting, we end up with the following. Take a moment to look at it. So immediately you can see that article is only written once. Everything inside the brackets gets compiled to be prepended with that parent, the parent being article, and the Sass above would get compiled to the first CSS example. So basically, this here is the same as this. Yeah, so take a few moments. Oh yeah, and you might have noticed that ampersand. I'm not sure. I think it's ampersand. So you might have noticed it. That is the parent selector and enables to extend and modify the parent directly without repeating yourself. So basically an example here. This is this SCSS on the left, and this is the resulting CSS on the right. I know this looks that it's not efficient to write this CSS, but believe me, once you start using bigger selectors and style sheets, this will definitely help you. So remember ampersand. It's basically, to put it simple, this ampersand basically replaces its parent. So the parent is article. So that's the same way as just writing article.wide, basically, yeah, the thing here. So are there any questions here? Because we are basically done here. So if you understand nesting, then it's all right, because it's not the most complex, but you should definitely understand what's going on here. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll try to answer them. All right, so it seems that everyone understands everything. So we can continue. I think the next topic is variables. Yeah. And one of the most commonly used item in any programming language is the variable, something which CSS lacked for a very long time. Native CSS variables were introduced in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So this preprocessor function is no longer as relevant as it was before, and the CSS variables do offer a bit more power compared to preprocessor variables, but oh my god, preprocessor variables are more performant because they are determined at the preprocessing stage when CSS is converted to CSS, as opposed to being processed by the browser during runtime, uh, making them more suitable in most cases. What I mean by that is basically with SCSS, you write the variables and they get calculated during the transpilation phase, which happens not in the browser, but when you're developing. And using CSS variables, they are calculated on the the client's machine, because they are not pre-calculated before. That's what I basically mean. And plus, native CSS variables don't work in Internet Explorer and old versions of other browsers. So by having variables at your disposal, you may define a value once and reuse it throughout the entire program. As you can see in the snippet here, the color, what's it, 0046 AD, seems to appear a few times, here, and this is a shade of it. So this might be a brand color or a secondary color. It doesn't matter, but it gets repeated a lot. The line height also seems to be repeated a few times here and here. In the interest of keeping things dry, we can use the $ symbol in SAS to declare variables. You might already seen the example when I actually showed you how to use SAS, but this is it. So basically, yeah, the $ brand. This is the syntax basically. So declaring the variables first enable us to group the used variables for easy scanning. I mean, because they are mostly declared on top of the file. It also means that if the brand color changes, we only need to change it in one place, which would be here, or wherever you're storing the variables, because most of the times they'll be stored in a separate file. So this above code was still compiled to be the same as our very first example, except it's a lot easier to read and maintain from a developer point of view, because these repeating values are more legible. I mean, you know that this is a line height and this is the brand color. You no longer need to guess whether the hex code is the same as it was before. So, well, at least to my mind, this is a lot easier. And you'll also notice I've used lighten on the hover effect right here. This is one of the many built-in functions available in the preprocessor, meaning that the hover color will always be a variation of the variable brand. So this is also useful to use the variables here. We will learn more about these built-in functions later, so don't stress out because of that. Well, I think variables are pretty straightforward. You just basically define them like this, and you use them like this. Always use the $. So if you have any questions, of course, feel free. I'll wait a few moments. Yeah, it is super useful, and you'll find out that using a preprocessor basically, well, makes CSS more manageable, because it's actually it's pretty complex when you look at it. All right, so no more questions. We're gonna dive into a more, I would say, a more complex topic, but mixins allow you to define styles that can be reused throughout the style sheet without needing to resort to non-semantic classes like, well, let's say float left, you might have seen, or margin 16 or something like that. Similar to function programming, they help you simplify your styles, saving you from having to remember prefixes or rewriting code. It also allows you to update code in one place rather than having to find and replace several bits of code. So heading back to our example code, the transition attributes on the link class could be consolidated into a mixin. So as you can see here, I don't think you remember it, but there was a transition property there. So basically what we do here, the transition mixin right here can be utilized throughout the project later. I mean, you might think that this is way too much for one line of code because this is actually more code than we had. But the thing is that we can actually use this mixin anywhere. And what it does is you write the mixin here by using the @mixin, what's called syntax. This is the mixin name, so transition. And this is the optional input, like in the function. You know, it's a parameter. So at this case, it's an attribute. So what it does is we just basically pass in a parameter, and it just makes a polyfill. These are vendor prefixes to make transitions work on Internet Explorer, on Opera, on older Firefox browsers, and so on. So basically, we replace the simple one-line transition, which works only on modern browsers, into this mixin. So one more example is, let's say you no longer need to support Opera. So you only need to delete this line here and not search your whole project for transition and delete them one by one. You just, if you use mixins everywhere, you just delete it right here and everything will be updated. So it's pretty simple to use. Let's say another smaller example. We can create a mixin, as I said, with the mixin command. It's just, I'm just going to demonstrate that in a simpler manner. So you don't necessarily need to provide an input parameter as it is right here. You can basically just name it and make yourself a reusable component, basically, where you can reuse these 3 lines of code. For example, a pretty simple way to describe it is you have a paragraph and you want the paragraph to contain the same font as in your project. Let's say this is like your brand font. You use it everywhere in the project. So yeah, create a mixin, use it everywhere. If you need to change the font at any basically moment, you just go to your mixin, change it, and it will affect your whole project. And this example here is, of course, with input parameter. So that is basically it. Yeah, it's a bit more complex, but I think you understand it, right? If you have any questions, of course, feel free to ask. I'll wait a few more moments. Yes, the question is, does it take 2 or more parameters? Yes, it takes however parameters you want, if I'm not mistaken. I never had to use more than 3, but yeah, it can take multiple. You just separate it with a comma, just like basically in JavaScript. All right, so I guess we can continue with imports. We can cut our huge CSS files into smaller pieces with Sass import feature. It is much easier to read and maintain smaller files rather than one big file with endless lines. The same can be said about, of course, JavaScript. You might have learned already. And actually, CSS also has an import feature now. I'm not sure when it was introduced, but it's still pretty new, but it works differently. Because native CSS imports send additional HTTP requests to the server each time to import a file. And Sass does it without an HTTP request, which is a faster approach. So basically how Sass works is just if you import a whole file, it just rewrites the whole file into the place where it was imported. So all you need to know is to import your Sass file with the @import command and just point it to another file. So basically, let's say you have a file foundation code.css right here and another file lists. You import them like this. So @import foundation / because it's under the folder foundation. So you use code, which is the name, and lists. And also note that we don't need to write the .css extension, and we don't need to use the underscore because this is called an index. We're not going to cover it in this lesson, but just know that, well, for, just don't name your files with an underscore before you know what an index is, basically, yeah. But you can just import it like this, pretty simple. No .css is needed. So as you can see on the right, when Sass imports a file, the file is evaluated as though its contents appear directly in place of the import. Any mixins, functions, and variables from the imported file are made available, and its CSS, it's included at the exact point where the import was written. So yeah, that's basically it. Any questions regarding imports? This is a pretty simple topic though, so. Yeah, I didn't think so. All right. So we're going to talk about a similar topic, extends. So extends let you share the entire list of CSS rules of one element with another element, hence the name extends, because elements can extend their full styling to other elements. This is basically like extending a class in CSS. So now the element with the ID, some other div, inherits all of the styling of the dinosaur div. So basically they are currently the same regarding CSS. But if you would watch this as a developer, you would see that basically they are related because some other div extends dinosaur div and maybe adds some other styles of its own. But by looking at it syntactically, you know that some other div is related to dinosaur div. Well, not in this example, of course, because nothing is clear here, but just syntactically, they are related now, just like a class would. This would be a base class and this would be its child. And you might have noticed a similarity between the mixins here. Well, extends and mixins are both ways of encapsulating and reusing styles in Sass, which naturally raises the question, or should raise the question, of when to use which one. So mixins are obviously necessary when you need to configure the styles using arguments. But what if they are just a chunk of styles, like the example here? So as a rule of thumb, extends are the best option when you're expressing a relationship, as I mentioned before, between semantic classes. Because an element with class.error serious is an error, it makes sense for it to extend the base class error, as you can see on the example on the left. But for non-semantic collections of styles, writing a mixin can avoid cascade headaches and make it easier to configure down the line. So as I mentioned before, basically the main rule of extends is use it whenever they're related classes, like this one, because the serious is part of error because it's an error itself. It does inherit the same properties as the error, but it adds its border, of course. You could rewrite this without extend, but extend is just syntactical sugar, I would say, to better understand the relationship. Any questions here? All right. So we'll move on to the actual logic operations. So let's start with simple loops. Another common item in languages. Something else CSS lacks. Loops can be used to repeat the same instructions multiple times without having to re-enter them multiple times. So in this example, we generate 3 different rules to display a slightly lighter shade of the color every 3 items. To be honest, I personally have never used it and can't think of a lot of scenarios where this could be useful. This is from the SAS homepage, the example. We can, of course, as you can see here, from 1 through 3. So we can use 2 instead of through. And what would that do is basically 2 would iterate without including the last number, and through would iterate with including the last number. So this will be 1, 2, 3. And if we use 2, then it will be 1, 2, and not including the last one. I'm going to write into the chat in case you. 2. So yeah, that's basically it. The syntax is a bit more complex. You use a variable here, you can reuse it here in the loop itself. Did you mean you never use loops or loops with colors? It doesn't matter whether it's a loop or a loop with color, it's still the same loop. It doesn't matter what you put in here. I just said that I never personally used loops with CSS in my life. I mean, I never actually met a use case for it, but I'm sure there are use cases. I'm just saying my personal standpoint. All right, so let's continue with conditionals. Yeah, another feature which CSS lacks. The if rule controls whether or not its block gets evaluated, including emitting any styles as CSS. And the expression used usually returns either true or false, just like in JavaScript. If the expression returns true, the block is evaluated. And if the expression returns false, it does not. So here we can see an example with conditionals and mixins, as we try to define an avatar with 2 classes. So basically, one of the classes needs a border radius and the other one does not, because one is a square and one is a circle. And this is a perfect use case for a conditional, but this only uses the if statement. So we will later find out the else statement as well. Take your time to review this code. Here are the multiple parameters with the default value as well. So basically, yeah, we define a square class, a circle class. We use the include because they are basically the same, only that the circle needs this block of CSS and the square does not. So if you ever find a situation where one class needs some small feature and the others do not, an if is a valid function to use. Now, if else's are actually pretty common use cases, I would say. Definitely more common than loops. And don't forget, this is always the resulting CSS. If you don't quite understand what's happening, this is the fully rendered result. Because mixins won't get rendered, of course, because they are not valid CSS. Okay, so let's continue and watch the else rule. So basically, an if rule can be optionally followed by an else rule. this rules block is evaluated if the if expression returns false. Well, I hope by now you know how if else works, because, well, basically it works the same here. It's just different syntax. So the example here basically decides whether to use the dark theme colors or not. The previous example was whether to show one parameter or not to show it, and this example shows a decision between two different style sets. So if you find the situation where you need to decide which style set to use an if-else statement. It's pretty simple. So again, this is basically a similar example with a mixin. You can see the actual expression here and the result here. And that is pretty useful to my mind. And that is basically it for conditionals. So if you have any questions regarding them, feel free to ask them. Because we are actually nearing our end. We still have 2 more small functions to cover. Yeah, but basically this is almost the end. So, well, we can just finish it and we can have a Q&A on the end. So one of the last functions I want to cover is math. So it's just a small note. Preprocessors allow for arithmetic to be written anywhere within a CSS rule, without the need for the calc function. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but the calc function basically does the same thing in native CSS. So you don't need that in the preprocessor, which is more performant because, again, it gets computed at the transpilation phase. So there's basically nothing much here. So let's just move on to functions. And so preprocessors support a wide variety of built-in functions. I have picked examples for altering colors, and due to time restrictions, you can find more examples on your own. I just listed some of the most popular ones here for altering colors. And I think their names are pretty self-explanatory in my opinion. Basically, we see in lighten, we just give it a color and the amount of percent to lighten it. And same for darken, of course, adjust hue. Basically, all of these act almost the same. Except for grayscale, which you just give it a color and it just turns it to grayscale. Pretty simple. Yeah, and that is basically it for the basics of CSS preprocessors. And again, I strongly encourage you to actually go and write some SCSS on your own time because you should really get used to it because most of the, well, basically I haven't seen a workplace in my own experience which doesn't use a CSS preprocessor. So this is a very valuable skill to learn. I'm actually it's been some time since I actually wrote native CSS. I always use a preprocessor myself because it's way simpler. So I'll just wait a few more minutes if you guys have any questions, and if you don't, then we can just finish this. All right, so I guess there are no questions. So see you guys later. Thanks for coming. Oh wait, does SAS has kinda interaction with global webpack to be processed on? Yes, yes, it does have an integration. I'm not sure by heart, but you can basically just set it up however you want it, because that's basically how modern development tools work. They automatically set up the compression of the CSS files. They set up watch functions, so you don't need to generate them yourself. So yes, I would most definitely guess that it does have an integration with most of the preprocessors because it's pretty simple to do. You can actually do it yourself even to customize it. All right, so if no more questions, then again, see you guys and thanks for coming.